we can start with the introduction so that we have as much time as possible to hear their remarks and to also have interactions with the audience and hear from you as well. So hi everyone. My name is Bianca Adam. I'm part of the World Bank's Global Crisis Risk Platform, where I lead work on compound risk and crisis preparedness analytics. Welcome to this session on monitoring compound risks in the COVID-19 time, COVID-19 era. Today's session is co-organized by us at the World Bank and by colleagues in the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN OCHA, and the Peace Building Support Office, PBSO, who are also joining us today. Unfortunately, as you all know, and I think the agenda of this year's Understanding Risk Conference is a sort of a stark reminder of that. COVID has really brought to the forefront of the development and humanitarian agenda the issue of compounding crisis, of compound risk. For us at the World Bank, we see that we see compound risk as a real threat to our goal of ending extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. So it is becoming more and more of a priority for our work. And so today we're going to try and unpack a little bit what we mean by compound risk, compounding, cascading, multidimensional risks. We hear these terms quite often, but what do they mean, and what do they mean for the way we do our job, for the way we can continue to support our clients as development institutions and as humanitarian actors? So, put simply, we talk about compound risks when we see the overlap of crises in time. So, think about the recent hurricanes in Central America, where we saw two back-to-back hurricanes hitting the same region in rapid succession. Or when we see overlap in space, or geographic overlap. So where there's a region that is affected over a longer period of time by multiple crises, and so think about the Horn of Africa, where there's ongoing food insecurity, COVID impacts, locusts, etc. And so, we are unfortunately, I think all of us connected here, too familiar with the devastating impacts that even a single shock can have, and we're increasingly seeing that when these shocks happen in close succession or overlap, this can really throw governments. It can really create a challenge for governments who are trying to manage the impacts on their people, on their economies. And this is what's happening right now. We see it from the bank's perspective, with many governments trying to juggle the societal impacts of the pandemic, while also responding and preparing for other shocks, all while dealing with an increasingly constrained fiscal space. So understanding and kind of monitoring these compounding risks becomes essential to be able to prioritize interventions and to be able to plan ahead. So today, over the next 2 hours, we're going to try to unpack a bit some of these concepts. We're going to explore what we can do to better track and monitor compound risks, and we're going and how to translate some of these findings into the way we do our work, into the way we design our operations, into the way we prioritize our support. So the session is divided in 2 parts. The first part will focus on approaches to modeling and monitoring compound risks, and some of the technical challenges and avenues to explore going forward. And we have a great group of speakers to help us share some insights on this and walk us through some of these concepts. We have Angelique Nika, Senior Analyst and Methodology Advisor at ACAP. We have Ahmed Amidhoun from IGAD, Technical Advisor on Disaster Risk Reduction for IGAD's Climate Prediction and Application Center. We have Lindsay Jones, Senior Risk Analyst at the World Bank in the Global Crisis Risk Platform team, and João Bevilacqua Basto, a consultant for UNOCHA and the bank on risk monitoring issues. Dirk-Jan Omig, Chief Economist and Head of the Humanitarian Financing Strategy and Analysis Unit at UNOCHA. And then secondly, we will discuss what it takes to translate analysis to action. We will hear about using compound risk analytics to inform operational decisions at the global and country level. And here we have with us today Irene Amoron, Technical Advisor on forecast-based financing with the Red Crescent Climate Center based in Uganda, who unfortunately has a cold, so her voice is a little bit low, but she'll still with us today, which is great. And then we have Connor Meenan, Lead Risk Finance Specialist with the Center for Disaster Protection. And last but not least, Nicola Ranger, who's a Visiting Business Fellow at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at the University of Oxford. So before we get started, a few housekeeping items. So to our speakers, a reminder to be brief, so we have enough time for Q&A with the audience. To our audience, please do share your questions through the chat function. My colleague Susie will be monitoring the chat throughout, and we will have 2 slots for Q&A, one after each of the 2 parts of the session. And finally, we'll use interactive polls throughout the session to get your views and also check that you've been listening. So this is very easy to use. We're using a sort of a separate app called Menti. We will share the link and a QR code on the screen and also on the chat. So you will just click. You can just click on the link or take a sort of a look at the QR code with your phone to connect to the polling app. And to get us familiar with the polling function, we'll try it out for a second with a few questions. So Thibaut is pulling up the QR code on the screen, and Susie, if you can put it on the chat as well, that would be great. If you could put the link, great. And please take a second to connect to the poll. The first question that we have is a pretty simple one, is where are you joining us from? We want to get a sense of who's connected and where you're connected from. We have 46 people connected with us, so I am going to vote as well. And let's see. Definitely a large group of people based in Europe and Central Asia, followed by North America and a few in East Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Well, that's great. And then second, so as you can see, it's quite easy to use. The second question, and this is a slightly different format. You can enter your answer, and in one word, what do you think is the most pressing crisis for next year, for 2021? What are you worried about for next year? Just share with us your thoughts. It will show as a word cloud, which wants to kind of get the pulse of the audience and what you're worried about as we think about compounding risks for next year. And clearly, climate remains a constant in all of our minds. And COVID and the economic recovery, of course, post-COVID, hunger and food insecurity play a big role, unfortunately, and maybe Dirk-Jan can talk about that a bit later during his intervention, about the looming food insecurity crisis that lies ahead. So thank you very much for playing along and testing the polling function with us that we will get to use throughout the session. So let us get started now with the first part of today's session: modeling and monitoring compound risks, technical challenges and approaches. And to get us started, let me invite Angeliki Nika from ACAPS for the first intervention in this session. Over to you, Angeliki.
Hello, everyone. I will try to share my screen now. So let me know if you can see the presentation. Great. Hi, everyone. I am Angeliki Nika. I am a senior analyst with ACAPS. I will say a few words about ACAPS for the ones among you that you're not familiar with the organization. ACAPS is an independent organization that provides information to inform decision making in the humanitarian sector. My team, the team I'm leading within ACAPS, is the Crisis Insight team. And we are responsible for producing the global portfolio of ACAPS that includes some standard products looking into regular monitoring of countries, the severity of different humanitarian crises, humanitarian access, and the global risk analysis, for which I'm going to talk a bit more today. First of all, I'm going to talk a bit more general about how our team is doing the risk monitoring and the global risk analysis that we produce. We have a team of analysts that are based in Geneva. It's a team of about 7 to 10 analysts. Each of them has a portfolio of countries that they monitor, and they are responsible for monitoring their countries, the humanitarian crisis that exists within countries, as well as doing risk monitoring and forward-looking analysis for them. The way that we go about it is that we have a daily monitoring. That means that analysts on a daily basis monitor already identified risks that are updated in the in-house risk list, as well as identifying new risks and new triggers that they monitor on a regular basis. Well, we also do a weekly review of the risk. This is in our joint analysis meeting, where we review all the different, the daily monitoring of the indicators and the risks that the analysts have identified. This goes on at least once a week, and there is where we discuss the different factors that go into the risk analysis and identify the risks that we think should be further developed for either specific publications or for further analysis. Now, all of this work is consolidated every 6 months and published in the format of our global risk analysis that includes identified high risks and also some of the medium risks that we think are notable and important to include in that. You will see here an example of the most recent global risk analysis that the team published on October 2020. This is a very quick overview where you can see the 8 risks that we identified as important for the next 6 to 9 months for organizations to consider. And also you will see the attached risk level that goes from low to high. the way that one of the big challenges that we had when preparing this report, in comparison with previous reports, was of course on how we will deal with the COVID-19 and there were a lot of discussions on if we should look separately for each of those countries the impact of COVID-19 on the risks we had already identified, or if we should include it in our analysis as any other factor or a trigger in some cases, in some specific context. There was a kind of big debate on that, on how we'll approach it in the methodology. We decided to go for the second option, to include it as not to look at it separately, but to include it in the risk of triggers and factors that we have identified for each of the risks that you see here. The reason why we chose to go this way is because our approach and our methodology is already considering multiple factors, multiple triggers for each of those risks. And I have selected two of those examples so that we can take a bit of a deeper look at the different factors that are actually quite different. And this will be Sudan and Lesotho, where you will see that in one of those, there are two very different cases, where in one of those, COVID-19 is one of the main drivers of the identified risks. And this is Lesotho, while in Sudan, there are so many different triggers and such a complex situation already existing in the country that it was truly the case where COVID-19 was one of the many drivers of further deterioration of humanitarian needs in the country. I will talk a bit now about the analysis spectrum that we implement, and you will see that there are two other steps that I have not included here, but I'm focusing here on the first 4 steps of analysis that we apply in ACAPS. And this is a descriptive analysis as the first step, where we try to answer questions as who, what, where, when, and how about humanitarian crises. Here, you will see that most of the analysis here is to summarize and compare information. Usually, these types of products that we produce are data sets or reports that are quite simple and present information without a lot of analysis going into that. Then the two other steps, which is to explain, trying to answer the why. Why is the situation like this? Does it make sense? How is it compared with other situations or with pre-crisis conditions? And then to interpret, which we try to answer, what does this piece of information mean? Why is it important? How sure are we, and so what about the specific analysis that we do? And of course, the last one is to anticipate. So what happens next? Now, broadly, the risk analysis, of course, falls under the 4th step of the anticipatory analysis, but it is necessary to follow all the previous steps and to follow the analytical process described here from step 1 until the last one, to be able for the analyst to develop the risk analysis and the forward-looking analysis. Now, when we do the risk analysis, there are multiple threat categories that we're looking at. The analysts are looking into natural hazards, either hydrometeorological or geophysical hazards such as landslides, storms, floods, earthquake, etc. They are looking into armed conflict and civil unrest, into epidemics and pandemics, drastic changes in the socioeconomic environment, such as a surge in price of essential goods, restricted government legislation, etc. At serious violations of international human rights law entered in international humanitarian law, and different environmental hazards such as industrial accidents or severe pollution. Most of the times, the case is that in the situations that we choose to present in our global analysis, many of those threat categories are included as triggers of the risk or as components of the risk itself. Now, I will talk a bit about the different steps that we take in our analysis. So the first one that is actually part of identifying the risk is doing a situation analysis. The situation analysis can include anything from recent developments, the current humanitarian conditions in a crisis, but also any contextual and background information that are relevant. Then step 2 is the identification of hazards. This is where the analysts are trying to actually look at the different elements and at the different compounding factors and create indicators out of those hazards. Look at the, we have some examples here about the different indicators that we have formed. And then we are moving actually into considering the risks. We are trying to estimate the humanitarian impact. This means that if this risk materializes, what will be the additional humanitarian cost, or what will be the additional impact on the population, and how much increase we will see in the humanitarian needs in the specific crisis. Then step 4 is where we assessed the probability of the risk. We are trying to answer questions such as how likely is this risk to materialize? And then the last 2 steps is about selecting and monitoring the risks. After the risk has been identified and developed, we go into a selection and profiling of the risks that will be presented in our global analysis. And then, of course, a monitoring and evaluation of the risk, which is an ongoing process and can last usually 6 to 9 months. You will see that this methodology that we follow focuses a lot, or is based a lot on not only quantitative aspects, but also on the expert judgment of different analysts, and also the network that they have built and the experts they consult on the ground or on regional and global hubs. I will close with 2 examples of countries that I mentioned before that we have included in our global risk report that was published back in October. So the first one has to do with Sudan, and we are looking into the risk itself looks into the severe economic deterioration in the country that may lead to an inability of the state to cope with immense economic and food insecurity. Now, as you will see here, we visualized a bit the steps that we applied based on the previous the methodology that I previously described. And here we have a situation where we have multiple triggers. We have triggers that are associated with that are related with the political and economic situation in the country. So and the baseline also of conditions in the country. So we see indicators here such as political violence, economic deterioration, prevalent food insecurity, and active disease landscape. And then the triggers that were identified for this specific risk which is the spread of COVID-19. It may be severe flooding, and also desert locust outbreak. Then the hazards that were identified were related to the economic crisis, increasing violence and instability, low foreign reserves, devaluated currency. And then the potential, the direct impact from that would be the limited humanitarian aid, loss of livelihoods of the population, inability to finance imports. And the humanitarian impact of that would be a severe, an increase and severe food insecurity, as well as potential mass displacement. Now, for the second example, I chose to show you the example of Lesotho. Here we have here we took a look at the first wave of the COVID-19 spread in the country, as well as the food insecurity assessment that was conducted in the country recently, that already foreseed a severe deterioration in food security conditions for the spread of COVID-19. And the risk that we're looking into going into a second wave of the spread of the disease is that the reintroduction of COVID-19 mitigation measures may result in decreased access to livelihoods and a further deterioration in food security. Just to give you the magnitude of that risk, according to the recent food insecurity assessment, almost 40% of the population of Lesotho will be on IPC phase 3 or 4, so facing severe, at least severe food insecurity in the next months. So we looked into how a second wave would actually further deteriorate those conditions in the country. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angeliki, and it was very, very interesting. So let me hand over right away to Dr. Ahmed Aminhoun from IGAD, sorry, for his presentation.
Thank you very much, and let me quickly share my presentation. I hope you can see perspectives on hazard assessment, hazard monitoring, early warning, and compounded risk. My presentation will be focusing on this part of the world, and particularly these 8 countries are members of the regional intergovernmental authority called IGAD. So this part of the world, particularly this Eastern Africa region, is mainly or predominantly arid and semi-arid, which also the livelihoods are based on primary activities, mainly on rain-fed agriculture and pastoralism. This is very important to bear in mind to what we're going to talk next. Also, as most of you might know, this region is also affected by recurrent hazards, which range from droughts, floods, and some others. Now, even the pandemic, COVID. Also, there is a high level of vulnerability due to several factors with low coping capacities in the face of climate change and extensive land degradation, so on and so forth. This really is now a challenge. So obviously this resulted in multiple and compounded vulnerabilities for the region. So sometimes one season shortage of rainfall could have or can result in a number of people affected. IGAD, this regional body, has a specialized institution or a climate center called ICPAC, which serves actually the whole Greater Horn of Africa region, and is also a designated climate center of WMO, World Meteorological Organization. This center mainly provides climate monitoring and forecasting services, which ranges from products from weekly to monthly to seasonal products. And the disaster risk management of IGAD is also based here. Looking at COVID, which is obvious challenge for all parts of the world, particularly for this region, it's an additional burden as it really creates a lot of hindrances towards addressing this already several challenges, several hazards in the region. I think as of yesterday, the region already has reached a 250,000 number of cases, and the number is, especially these 2-3 weeks, is increasing. The other hazard in the region is again the desert locust, which was again kind of, it's addressed in some part of the region, but again there is hatching of eggs, and it comes once more. Then the movement is also based on wind directions and several other factors. So this particular challenge is also important for the region, given that most of the livelihoods are based on, as I said, rain-fed agriculture, so crops will be affected, or pastoralists, which are which also uses forage or pasture as an important source of their livelihood. This definitely has contributed to food and feed insecurity in the region, and it's still an ongoing challenge. As I said, a lot of efforts have been made to control it, but since the locusts, pass over, lay egg, and then die away. But again, the eggs will hatch in 3 months, and the system is continuing. And I think our forecast yesterday is that for December, still there are movements, particularly from east to west, which still makes it a very important challenge for the region. Floods are again quite increasing, particularly over the last 1.5-2 years. The region has been receiving excess rainfall, which definitely has contributed to flooding. So the reports we have is around 6 million people have been affected since mid last year, which resulted in damage or destruction of thousands of housing units, crop lands, infrastructure, which also impedes movements of people and goods, including humanitarian assistances to affected people. In the recent years, we have seen, as I said, more frequent and more intense floods for these parts of the world, which can be attributed to several factors, mainly of climate change. The other interesting phenomena in this region is cyclones. Cyclones were not a common phenomena in this part of the world, but again, since 2018, about half a dozen of cyclones have happened. This one, for example, just happened few days back, and it's one of the strongest. Cyclone Gati is one of the strongest cyclones that has affected particularly the coastal areas of Somalia. So these phenomena are becoming now more common, and the monitoring aspect of it should be again on our table. ICPAC, of course, do monitor whenever there is some developments. We do monitor the movements of the cyclones. We also use data from global centers. Yes, the cumulated impact of this, of course, is creating, in addition to others like conflicts, is on food insecurity. This was for April, the assessment for April, and already 35 million people were food insecure, let's say IPC phase 2. And we have already about 10 million internally displaced people. Now it's on top of this that COVID has just arrived, and things are far worse than April this year. Just to give you some ideas on the monitoring and early warning aspects of hazards in the region, these maps were from 2013, where we try to identify common hazards in the region, which are drought-prone areas, flood-prone areas, epidemics, desert locust, and of volcanism. These were just a base map but we are now moving more into a dynamic monitoring of hazards. Like, for example, this is a drought monitoring based on multiple indicators, which for sure gives an idea of what to expect in light of these monthly forecasts. The region also, particularly ICPAC, also holds a regional climate forum, which happens 3 times a year. Before the start of every season, ICPAC calls for this regional meeting where the forecast is given and the sectors indicated here, the health, agriculture, water, climate, livestock, and disaster risk reduction sectors from member countries will come and will make analysis in terms of anticipatory impacts of the forecast, where there is high rainfall, what to expect, and where there is far below normal rains, what to expect, and some preparatory measures will be identified. But they will also take this regional analysis further down to their countries and do downscaling to more put it into context. This graph is basically what we do every season in trying to understand what are the most common hazards for the season. As you can see already in March to April this year, COVID stands number 1, which shows how countries were panicking when it was starting. But now, as time goes, we have seen also not only the direct impacts, but also the indirect impacts. The others were desert locusts, floods, others like conflicts, landslides, drought, and epidemics. We also do produce such seasonal maps, basically to depict the impacts. For example, mortality, which countries have suffered how many mortalities, animal diseases, housing destruction or number of houses destroyed or damaged, total number of people displaced, affected and displaced. Those maps are again produced every season, particularly in trying to understand which countries are bearing the burden most. This is maybe just one slide before my conclusion. In light of these compound risks, multiple hazards, IGAD also developed a regional strategy, which is food security and nutrition and response strategy, which was fundamentally meant to address the key issues, the key challenges, and also the interventions, possible interventions in those areas. As you can see, 4 of the key priorities identified in the strategy are emergency response, because COVID is really creating an immense burden on our member countries. Regional coordination is also very key. Preparedness and capacity enhancements were also identified as one. And the 4th is recovery and resilience. As I said, the most important one now is how we can move with the coming of vaccines and so on, how we can now recover and how communities can bounce back to where they were before the pandemic. Just to conclude my presentation, in general, this compounded, these multiple risks have created a context where developing economies like our region have to face complex emergencies, and also this further aggravates systemic risks, including taking down more people to poverty, rising unemployment, so on and so forth. So the direct impacts are there, but the systemic risks are also there, which really creates a sustained challenge for the region. In terms of hazard monitoring and forecasting, our center provides those products, but these products has to be translated into developing preparedness and response scenarios, particularly in anticipation of the possible impacts out of this compounded or multi-layer risks. Risk profiles, again, are quite essential. Understanding, particularly issuing early warning or alerts might be much easier compared to having a full-fledged information on vulnerabilities, coping capacities, which gives a clear picture of the risk. In that regard, I think IGAD is recently embarking on establishing a disaster risk operation facility, which will be monitoring all those compounded risks and be able to also advise on the impacts, not only on just the risks or the anticipated risks, but also the impacts of those risks. What we believe now is implementation of such a robust strategies like our disaster risk management strategies, national strategies, policies would significantly reduce the impacts of disasters. No matter what, what's happening, we have to still stick to those strategies and implement the priorities identified in order to abate the challenges that we're facing. Of course, more investments and better preparedness are also quite essential in the face of these compounded risks. I think I rest my case here, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting and sobering reminder of the many compounding risks that the countries in the IGAD region face, and the importance of the work that you're doing to monitor, understand, and help manage those risks. So now I'm going to hand over to Lindsay, my colleague Lindsay Jones, and Joao to talk a bit about the efforts that our respective organizations are doing to develop an in-house compound risk monitoring system to eventually support decision-making of our management. Over to you, Lindsay.
Great, thank you, Bianca. And just to check, can you see here the presentation? Perfect. Okay, so hi everyone. Yeah, my name is Lindsay. I am, as Bianca mentioned, a risk analyst working in the bank, and in particular working in a platform called the Global Crisis Risk Platform. Within that, one of the really strong arms that we've been developing at the moment together with Bianca and a few others is an emphasis on trying to track and monitor compound risk. So this presentation really is an attempt to kind of explore a little bit of some of our thinking, explore some of our collaborations with partners. And in that spirit, I'm also co-presenting this with Joao, who is at OCHA, and will take us through some of the challenges and next steps in some of our collaborative tools that we've been developing. So let me get started. I don't really need to say anything about the importance of compound risk. I think everyone in this room understands that. Unless you've been living in a cave for the last 9 months, you will really know that multiple risks, interacting can often result in compounding issues, compounding threats that result in impacts far, far greater than those single hazards. We saw that very clearly early on. This is Cyclone Harold in the top left that came barreling through in the Pacific early on in the kind of the COVID crisis, when people were locking down and we had the first country level lockdowns, and that created a lot of concern about how we interact in terms of a humanitarian space when we have a pandemic going on. We also have, as was mentioned before on the IGAD side, a locust outbreak that's been developing for the past few months, interacting with issues of food insecurity, interacting with conflict and fragility, all of which creating a very kind of delicate compounding risk situation. And then increasingly in places like the bank and the IMF, we put together projections on things like poverty and GDP, and we can definitely see that the impacts of things like COVID are going to have tremendous impacts on our ability to actually carry on the great progress we've been making in making reductions in poverty. So all that to say that there really is an importance on our part as people interested in risk, people who are working in organizations that take a responsibility in risk monitoring to make sure that we're factoring compounding risks into account. One of the fortunate things is actually that COVID has brought about a kind of a renaissance in a way of real-time monitoring tools. I think people really have access to a lot of those. We've seen things like the Financial Times, New York Times, these kind of big global outlets, Johns Hopkins University as well, putting real-time metrics into the hands of everyday people to help us understand how things are evolving in real time. There are obviously great initiatives like ACAPS and others, which I use in my day-to-day activities. And what we really, are hoping for is that this kind of galvanizes this momentum behind the use of forward-looking and real-time metrics on risk, which is a great kind of impetus. One of the few nice things about COVID has, really been able to spur. With all that in mind, we still have a problem in that many of our organizations, and the bank is no exception, we still characterize risk in accordance to particular silos, right? So we will have our food security teams, we will have our fragility and conflict teams, we will have our macro teams, and all of those will tend to look at risk in their particular points of view with their entry points that they have, which is not a problem. The only problem is that, in a sense, when we have things like COVID, we realize that we can't be stuck in those silos. We have, expertise, we have risks that we need to be considering outside of our traditional areas that we work in and that we normally have contacts around. So that's really been a big spur. And in the bank, we had that problem. So at the start of the crisis, we kind of got together and realized we need to be better at tracking compounding risks, tracking where there are multiple aspects, multiple different threats that are interacting. And again, maybe it's worth me taking a step back to explain what we mean by compound risk, because it doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. From our perspective, what we're usually talking about is different overlapping types of threats and interactions between those. So as Bianca mentioned earlier, that could either be over time, so 2 cyclones happening back to back, which recently happened in Nicaragua. It happened earlier a few years ago in Mozambique and devastated both of those places. It could also be 2 different types of hazards interacting at the same time in the same space. So we could have, like we have now in many places, a locust outbreak, a La Nina, which is intensifying at the moment, food security, fragility, all of those things compounding together to make the sum of that risk much higher than those individual parts. So that's really important to understand when we're thinking about compounding risk. And what we found through the World Bank as we started to develop internal tools to track compounding risk in real time is that we weren't alone. And we quickly got in touch with other colleagues in the UN, particularly in OCHA and PBSO, and we realized that actually we were developing the same tools. So instead of doing that separately, we got together and decided to create a technical working group whereby we're trying to share some of that knowledge. We're also trying to develop a kind of a guiding framework. So we don't have to have the same metrics and the same exact tools, but we want to be drawing on the same approach so that we kind of build on our shared knowledge and expertise. So what I'm going to do is try to take you through a little bit of some of those results, a little bit of that framework as well at the higher level that we as a working group have been trying to build ourselves around. And what we've done, in a sense, to look at compound risk is starting to break it down into different aspects. So like I mentioned, compounding risk is often multiple different types of threats interacting. So our first challenge was to think about which kinds of threats are we particularly interested in. And to do that, we've started breaking it down into, at the moment, we have 7 different drivers of compound risk. You can think of these as catalysts. So particular types of threats and vulnerabilities that interact with others. And when they do so, they create these kind of compounding effects. We know that they are much larger in a sense than those singular aspects of risks that if you consider them on their own. And these range from the usual ones that you see in many risk monitors, things like food security, natural hazards. At the moment, there's a strong emphasis on COVID, so obviously wanted to include that, all the way up to conflict and fragility and issues of vulnerability. And it's important to mention here that in those drivers, we're not only looking at individual hazards, right? Because we understand that compounding events can arise when you have 2 different hazards interacting together, but it can also be as a result of a decrease in vulnerability. So for example, if you have a very, very sharp drop in someone's baseline levels of resilience, and you have 2 relatively small, normally inconsequential hazards occurring, that can lead to a compound event, even though those 2 hazards weren't really anything particularly that we would normally track. It's the fact that there was this sharp decrease in baseline resilience that caused that. So we include that in part of our tracking system as a driver, as a catalyst of compound risk. So across these 7, what we essentially try to do now with our kind of common framework is to identify forward-looking indicator and indices. Like I mentioned before, we now have a wealth of real-time and some cases forward-looking indicators spread across a number of different risk monitoring agencies, ACAP's obviously being one, but there are a number of others. In the bank, we have many different tools that we use to track things like macroeconomic shocks, to track changes in poverty and expected poverty. There are also many others that we use externally as well. So, on the natural hazard side, there are seasonal outlooks that a number of different climate outlook forums use, such as with IGAD and ICPAC, and so on and so forth. So we try and populate as much as we can the best, to our knowledge and to our extent, indicators we can see that have this 3 to 6 month outlook on letting us know whether at the country level there is a change in risk conditions. So whether that country is experiencing conditions where we think we should be concerned about in relation to each of these 7 drivers. What we then do is I try and identify particular risk thresholds for each of those indicators. So these are thresholds that tell us, based on expert elicitation, if this indicator is above that certain level, we know that something weird is going on in that country. We know that there are changing risk conditions, and therefore we should be concerned again about the status of that country. So we identified plenty of these different thresholds and indicators, each for individual indicators, like I said, as well as then for the drivers overall. And we aggregate each of these individual indicators into a kind of a status check for each of those drivers. There are different ways that we do that, and there are methodologically a lot of different limitations, a lot of different advantages for different approaches. At the World Bank, our default approach is actually to come up with a flagging system. So we're not really interested in coming up with a composite index. We're not coming up with a predictive system. All we're doing is flagging where there are multiple drivers that are above particular thresholds that we think have the preconditions to lead to compounding crises. So again, it's not a predictive tool. We're not coming up with a number. We're saying that of the 7 drivers that we normally associate with compound risk, a number of these, so we could say 3 out of the 7 are high risk. Therefore, the conditions are very strong that there is a likelihood of compounding events in that. So it's a little bit of a step back. It's an attempt to make it a little bit more transparent and easier to understand. And we do that by essentially counting the number of indicators within each of these drivers that are above that threshold. And like I said, the way that we then gauge the extent to which a country is at risk is the number of the 7, which however many of those 7 drivers are above that threshold. So let me give you a little bit of a teaser. I'm a geographer, so I love maps. So sorry, you're going to get part of that as well as part of this presentation. I also don't want us to take too much of time and emphasis on the exact numbers in the countries, right? This is essentially just to show you a little bit of the type of output that we would imagine. This is a prototype, so there's a lot of things that still need to be ironed out, but this is essentially what we get at the moment, right? So when we look across those 7 drivers, what you can see here highlighted are countries where more than 3 of those 7 drivers are above our kind of thresholds designated by our own internal and external experts, right? So this is where we think more than 3 of those particular catalysts are experiencing trends that we're worried about, right? And you can see that there's actually quite a lot of geographic spread. Not only is it in sub-Saharan Africa, but we have quite a large pocket in Latin America, as well as in MENA and South Asia, right? And we can also create some narratives and provide a little bit of understanding as to what's driving those. And that's where it gets really interesting, right? So why is it that Latin America has quite a large number of risks emerging? Well, we know that there has been persistently high rates of COVID. Places, especially like Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, they have consistently been associated with high COVID incidence and exposure. But more importantly, on the Latin America side, there is a lot of concern, particularly from projections coming out of the bank and the IMF, that the macroeconomic impacts of COVID are going to be relatively large. So falls in GDP expected in the next year are going to be particularly large, including fiscal concerns, particularly in relation to debt. And there's also concerns as well about the numbers of people that will likely be pushed into poverty as a result of the knock-on implications of COVID, as well as a few other drivers that go along with that. On the Horn of Africa, the last presentation covered a number of these. So, things like the desert locust outbreaks is obviously a very serious concern. We have a La Nina that is intensifying, and that applies in particular to the Horn of Africa, especially when we consider that food insecurity across much of the region is really intensifying. So that's a kind of a snapshot of that region. And then, in MENA and South Asia, particularly in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, we have this confluence of COVID, again, macroeconomic concerns around the impact that COVID will have over the next year. And like I mentioned, this intensifying La Nina, which particularly for Afghanistan, the seasonal forecast is particularly dire. So all of that is kind of giving you a snapshot of what's happening at the global level, but gives us a tool, a guiding framework to help us understand where there are kind of changing risk conditions where compounding risk might be a concern. One last thing I want to leave you with, again, is a different map, but what we know is that places can experience changing risk conditions, but they can all deal with that in different ways. There are some countries that are better at dealing with a large change in GDP, a large fall in GDP than others. So we need to factor that in as well. This map is simply showing us where are there changing risk conditions that we might want to know about. So what we can also do then is factor in those kind of baseline vulnerabilities for each of those 7, put that into our system, and try and revert the map and see how that changes things. What we do when we kind of combine those two is we see a very interesting outlook, right? The main countries in kind of Central Africa, the Horn, and elsewhere stay broadly similar. They almost intensify in a way, but we lose a lot of the kind of vulnerabilities in Latin America. What that's telling us is that, yes, there are likely to be compounding crises that we expect in Latin America, but they're able to deal with them slightly better than in some of the countries that have highlighted here. And in particular, places like Afghanistan and Somalia, we really have a high incidence. That's actually where we have all 7 of the drivers that we talked about before are above the threshold. So there's really a concern on our part that a compound crisis may, or the conditions for a compound crisis are rife. So that's, again, just to give you a global snapshot. Don't worry too much about the exact specifics, but I think it's important to see what sorts of products we can start to develop. And our aim at the moment is to refine these, to work together with others in our partnership and outside to try and make sure that this is a tool that can be used for others. I'm now going to hand over to Zhao, who will tell you a little bit about some of the processes that we're thinking about for next steps in this kind of partnership, as well as some of the challenges that we've experienced in developing some of these tools. So Zhao, I don't know if you're online, yeah. But
there you go. Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks for this presentation and the monitor and our shared principles. I'm just want to start saying that I'm honored to be part of this work and this collaboration across the our organizations, because I think it is so much needed. I'll try to make this really brief just to save some time for discussants, but I will talk about the challenge and the next steps that wait for us on the compound risk. And as I understand that everybody here really knows, they are not few, right? But I'm confident that we can move from managing disasters to really managing the risks. I'm just gonna start stating the obvious and how much data is still needed. We still have significant gaps and spatial distributions. Some drivers are way better represented than the others. And we need better access, especially at subnational and household levels, for instance. Our second challenge is regarding factoring on how to quantify interactions between different drivers, right? As Lindsay was talking about, the flags can provide a clear view of excess risks, but we still might need to do more in trying to figure out how this compound effect works between them. And the reason, of course, is just because the sum of the parts is greater, right? The third and the fourth point that we need ways to combining quantitative and qualitative insights to embrace diversity. Some of the risks simply cannot be forecasted, and others have large uncertainties. And specific country needs or outliers events requires us to be flexible and agile enough to reassess our models, right? So that's something that we have to keep in mind when we're trying to figure out these models, is not make them just untouchable again. I'm just gonna move for the next slide really quick, Lindsay, if you can, please. Okay. This point is just about, we need this long-term commitment to share knowledge and lessons learned with all stakeholders. I think this event is a great example of that. And I want to emphasize the all part, right? We need all the stakeholders' input on this, because as we all know, the risks are diverse and they're really hard to have this comprehension. So it is important to have all these different views. The second one is just critical to ensure transparency and easy of interpretation of decision makers. That's something that we've been talking about, and something that we are really concerned to make our monitor really clear and transparent and easy to understand. Because if it is not resonating with authorities and communities, to be completely honest, it is going to be really hard for them to use and have some ownership, which is our final goal, right? Which links to this final point that ideally what we want with this compound risk monitor and next steps is that it could really link early warnings with disaster risk financing. Yes, it is complex to implement preventive interventions to compound crisis, but it's also more efficient in terms of development if you can tackle these things before, right? So that is our goal, to make this thing really clear, to be a trigger for any kind of projects that our organizations are doing. And really, I just want to close my remarks, inviting all to join this, basically this community of practice. We all need it, and we all need different inputs, insights. So anyway, I hope we can, do a better work and the future of preventing these risks. With that, again, I'm going to close my remarks and get back to Bianca and Dirk-Jan for their comments. And thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Joao, and thank you, Lindsay. Before I hand over to Dirk-Jan for his reflections on the three presentations that we heard, I am going to ask you again to play along with our polling today and start get a few of your reactions. So do click on the link that Susie should be sharing any second on the chat, or use the QR code that's on the screen. And the first question that we have for you is about how can monitoring of compound risks best support your work? So tell us, share some of your reflections on this. What do you see as the value of compound risk monitoring for the type of work that you do? Very interesting. So it's about targeting and planning is one of the top concerns, and identifying hotspots rapidly follows, as well as understanding the broader risk landscape. Thank you very much. So then question number 2, Thibaut, if you can share, what future advances in compound risk monitoring will be the most relevant to your line of work? So tell us what you think. Is it greater emphasis on subnational information, longer term forecasts, better understanding of how risks interact, improved ways of combining quantitative risk information and qualitative insights, and that we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. Let's just give up. So it's good that not many people think that we should give up. That's reassuring. And the interaction of risks seems something that is since top of mind for most of you. So that's a really useful insight and confirms what we've been saying, I guess, discussing today, that understanding those interactions is really challenging. Okay, so thank you so much for playing along, and let me hand over to Dirk-Jan for a few reflections before we open to the Q&A. Over to you, Dirk-Jan.
Wonderful, thank you, and thank you to all the speakers for 3 fascinating and complementary presentations. Let me offer a couple of reflections. ACAP's work is just phenomenal and phenomenally valuable to the entire community, and it's actually quite useful to recall the key principles of risk analysis according to ACAPS. It's context dependent, it's not an exact science, and the probability of a risk doesn't need to be high to be of a concern. And both ACAPS and our colleagues at EGAT drew attention to the various dimensions of risks or threats, and the need for timely and dynamically updated risk information for it to be useful. Now, this is exactly what we see, right? I mean, these tail-end events that we need to be concerned about, such as a global pandemic. And we saw in the case of the COVID crisis, the public health effect was also dwarfed by the secondary socioeconomic impact. And that's now what we see is driving humanitarian needs. The GHO, the Global Humanitarian Overview, was launched the day before yesterday, and we've seen a 40% increase in the number of people needing humanitarian assistance to 235 million people. And that's almost entirely and exclusively through as a result of the secondary impact of COVID. And as World Bank colleagues have calculated, up to about 115 million people could be pushed into poverty into next year. And we think that food insecurity is going to rise to about 265 million, almost a doubling of where it was previously, and a real risk of famine in some of the countries also highlighted on the map. So what was interesting about the questions that were identified by ACLAD is they were particularly exposed to certain pathways of the economic shock. Look at the Venezuela that was on the map. Why is that so problematic? Because Venezuela is highly dependent on the export of primary commodities. Similarly, you saw the map that was just shown by Lindsay as well, Nigeria showing up. Why? Because 87% of Nigeria's export is crude oil. Haiti came up as well. Why is that? Well, it's highly dependent on remittances. Why was Ethiopia lightening up? Well, one of the reasons is that it's 25% of export in Ethiopia are from tourism, and other reasons could be the limited fiscal space or highly indebted status. And again, that's why we saw Sudan coming up. So it gives a really good, useful snapshot as well of the countries, but also the reasons probably why they are showing up as being at high risk. And what we also saw throughout is the realization that COVID and the COVID crisis is not happening in isolation, right? Compared to the last 2 decades, we've seen crisis and events related to extreme temperatures double. And that climate crisis that's happening at the same time is really impacting a lot of the countries that we're concerned about. 8 of the 10 countries most vulnerable to the effect of climate change currently have an interagency humanitarian appeal already. And climatic events can also trigger secondary events like the swarms of desert locusts that we're not getting under control, and that's also impacting Sudan. So, and finally, what I loved about the ACLED presentation is the 4 phases of the of analysis and the ultimate objective trying to anticipate. Now, Dr. Ahmed really provided us with a deep dive in risks in the Horn, and also reminded us about the various risks that and overlapping risks that they're facing: drought, floods, conflict, locusts, and then also emerging risks that weren't there previously, cyclones and COVID. And in my previous job, when I lived in Nairobi, I worked a lot with the wonderful colleagues at IGAD, the former Executive Secretary, Ambassador Mahmoud Malin, and of course the ECPAC colleagues. And what I loved about the presentation was the all the maps. Now, I know that Luca from the JRC is online, and together with Luca, we developed a sub-national risk index for the Horn already a number of years ago, together with IGAD. And that's really highlighting an important dimension that we saw throughout all the maps, and that's the geospatial dimension. So it's not just how it is impacted, but also where it is impacted, because risks have spillover effect. A conflict in one country, Sudan, will have consequences for neighboring states. Risks can also transcend countries in other ways. For example, if one country doesn't contain locusts, that has immediate spillover effects for neighboring states. At the same time, and what we saw on the maps as well, is that risks and impact can be very local. Flooding, flash flooding can be very, very local. And we see that vulnerability within countries is much greater than vulnerability across countries if you measure it. So northern Kenya, 80% of the population are in extreme poverty, but around Nairobi, less than 20% are. A huge variation within a state. And of course, our understanding of these risks really need to be informed by regional knowledge and expertise. And the GARCOV is doing such tremendous job in bringing together all the experts from across the region to give us a fantastic view of the climate outlook. And what's important is that that's great, and it has improved over time. So our skill level to getting a view of climate is improving, and not just the hazard itself, but also the hydrological impacts, the real-time monitoring of NDVI, and the projected humanitarian impact, like the great work that FSN-WG is doing, and I know that Ocha is supporting it, is important. So this is now allowing us to start visualizing where vulnerabilities and risks start to overlap, and where therefore we can expect impact. And that then allows us to get ahead of a crisis and anticipate it. People were talking about Sudan and overlapping crises. So OCHA released in June of this year finance because we saw the risk of rising food insecurity because of locust, floods, and COVID compounding. And we provided over 1 million people in Somalia with pre-arranged financing. And because we did some risk analysis based on the EGAT data, our disbursement was 3 times faster than normal. So doing this in a structured manner is useful, and it's going to make a real difference. And that's why I really love the final presentation from Lindsay and Zhao, and the fantastic collaboration that we have going. Because humanitarian crises are not caused by a single shock, but are very much the confluence of climatic, socioeconomic, conflict, and other public health shocks. And the COVID crisis is just a really good example of that. And when they describe beautifully when 2 threats happen simultaneously, the collective impact is or can be far greater than the sum of its parts. And therefore, identifying emerging compound risk is vital for identifying countries at risk of a rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation. And that requires, from the humanitarian side, to also look at dimensions not ordinarily the domain of humanitarians. Look at if there's a macroeconomic deterioration, which a shortage of hard currency or decline in remittance, that can have an immediate and severe impact on humanitarian needs. So, and risk and compound risk is a very useful concept to convene partners from different parts of the house, the humanitarian, development, and the peace and security domains. What's going to be very helpful is this desire to work towards a common view of risk. And so we can actually have a collective response for that. And for that to be successful, the methodology needs to be very transparent, and because otherwise it's not going to be accepted. I thought it was very good that you are not driving towards an index. It's not a rank ordering of countries. It's actually a monitor. It should drive a further investigation and an examination of the potential pathways of compounding risks. And the test of the success will be if it helps us to act, to change the default from wait and see to anticipate and act. And if we do this, and if we do this together, then we will make a real difference. And this agenda is really worth pursuing. Back over to you, Bianca.
Thank you, Dirk-Jan, for those reflections. I think you really did a great job at highlighting some of the common threads between the presentations and the challenges that lie ahead. So let's take a few minutes to get some of the questions from participants. I see there's already some chats going on in the chat. Let me first ask Henk-Jan Brinkman from UNPBSO. I think you wanted to come in with a few comments. I'll hand over to Henk-Jan and then address some of the questions in the chat. Over to you. I think you're muted. Can't hear you.
Is this better?
Yes, now we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Perfect.
So no, they're really fascinating, really great presentations. So I wanted to draw a little bit of attention to the conflict risks, which I think are a little bit of a different character than the natural disasters and climate-related risks that a lot of the presentations focus on. We know with a lot of the natural disasters and climate-related things, we know that things will happen. If you're in a cyclone zone, there will be a cyclone at one point. It's just a matter of when and what force. If you live in an earthquake zone, it will happen at one point. And therefore, investment in adaptation and might be a little bit, and disaster preparedness might be a little bit easier to sell to politicians. But with conflict risk, it's quite different, because there is no a must that specific factors will always lead to a violent conflict. It really depends on what institutions there are in a country that can manage conflict in a non-violent manner, so it doesn't escalate into violent conflict. So you have to look much more at the root causes of issues, and a lot of them are in economic and social area. The UN, I think, has three weaknesses that is really struggling with around this, and one is incorporating a good economic and development risk analysis, partly because economists, and I'm one of them, think also in silos like everybody else, and they have really trouble linking a debt crisis or high inflation with political risks. So making those linkages and integrating those aspects is really problematic. And the second is exactly what the topic of this webinar is the compounding risks. How are different risks interacting with each other? And of course, it's really difficult. I think we're all struggling with that, and the UN is certainly not alone. And the third one is, I think, how to translate the risk analysis into action. And the UN, of course, is the only global organization that really has mandates across the spectrum, from humanitarian to political to peace and security and development, and human rights issues. And therefore, it really needs to look at all these issues and actions in a coherent way. Problems are not siloed, and the solutions cannot be siloed either. And so we need to know when, what, and where, or prioritize in a sequenced manner of what parts of the UN should do what, and that's really important to be helpful, to have an analysis that really is providing details on how a specific risk would manifest itself. And of course, that's much more important in terms of conflict than it is important than in terms of a locust infestation. So the how and the when is really important to be able to determine exactly what kind of preventive measures there are. And that step, it's certainly high priority for the Secretary General, that we need to move from a very good crisis response mechanisms that the UN has to a much more preventative approach within the UN. And as the UN World Bank report, Pathways for Peace, has shown, there are huge savings to be made in terms of lives and resources with regard to prevention. So I'll leave it here. And unfortunately, I have to also jump to another meeting. So a really interesting colleague of mine, Victoria, will remain online, and I'm looking forward to hearing from her the rest of the discussion. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Henk-Jan. So I saw that there were a few questions in the chat, but they've been answered by the speakers. So in the interest of time, let's move on to part two. And I think Henk-Jan's presentation, intervention was a good segue and a reminder of the need for actionable analysis, and analysis that is suited to inform operational and financial decisions. So for part two, we're going to discuss linking analysis to action and how compound risk analytics can inform operational decisions both at the global and at the country level. And to get us started, we have Irene from the Red Crescent Climate Center, connected from Uganda. Over to you, Irene.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Hi, everybody. I hope I am audible enough. And thank you, my fellow presenters. So I think I would like to acknowledge Henk-Jan's concluding remarks. How do we transition from reactionary to, anticipating and act? And that is what the vision that the Red Cross has right now, that how can we scale up anticipatory action? And one of the things that we all agree is that COVID has reminded us that it is futile to look at disasters, to look at risks in silos. And so we as learning organizations, we should be able to pick up something from these scenarios and then, put it into action. So I will share briefly how some decisions are taking place, particularly picking up an example from Zambia. I'll also share the challenges. I'm glad that all of us in this space appreciate that handling and discussing compounding risks is not a piece of cake. It's quite a very challenging space, but I'm glad that we are all here to learn and support each other to move forward. So what you see there is a cartoon that was designed by a colleague, Rebecca, and from a humanitarian looking at all these various risks. Where do you begin from, And I want to believe that these are all the challenges that we've grappled with this year. And, we can relate that violence has happened. There is migration, there is a COVID, there is a floods, there are cyclones, all happening in the same place at the same time, or happening one after the other. And I just want to reflect back, again, picking up from Zambia, that when we started developing a focus-based financing system, we were focused on a flood, and that was guided by the National Contingency Plan of Zambia, and they were focusing on flood for 2018 based on the previous forecast. And therefore, we said let's work on developing an anticipatory action for floods. 1 year into this whole process development, we begin seeing effects of limited rainfall. And of course, there were indicators of a drought. And as all of you are aware, last year, Southern Africa has suffered from impacts of a drought. So the conversation was, should we drop what we are currently working on for floods and pick up on drought? We had invested a lot of time and effort focusing on one hazard, and then we are now beginning to live through another hazard. So how do we handle that? And unfortunately, and for understandable reasons, the agreement was: can we continue working on can we continue developing an anticipatory action for floods? And once we are done with this, then we begin working on the one for for drought. But at the end of the day, we are having the same people affected by these different risks. And this therefore calls for us to reassess our strategy. So how should we collaborate? Just like this year, disasters have collaborated better. We have floods, we have locusts, we have a drought, we have COVID. How can we also, as humanitarians, be able to coordinate better and address these risks before they turn into disastrous impacts? And I'm happy to note that within the Red Cross, there's been a big push towards multi-hazard planning and also integrating anticipatory action, which before had not been the case. So before, it was mainly focusing on a contingency plan whereby we would be able to respond. So now we're saying, can we have multi-hazard plans that take into consideration aspects of anticipation, especially for hazards that are forecastable? And that is what we are trying to focus our emphasis on. Okay, sorry, just a minute. Yes. So just to take us very briefly, I would want to have a very short, okay, this we will do it later with our colleagues later. So a quick sneak peek into Zambia, what has been happening in Zambia. And what you see here on the screen is a kind of a combination of all the risks that have been happening in Zambia. We do have COVID, which all of us do not want a reminder of where we are at, but we do have COVID. Zambia suffered from drought. We do have the armyworm that drastically affected maize. As most of us may know here, that maize is the main staple food in Zambia. So the armyworm, especially 2015, 2016 affected the maize harvest, and then of course the locust and flooding. So these are all happening in most cases in the same region, affecting the same people, and sometimes back to back with each other. So the question is, what do we do to be able to address these risks? What do we do to be able to reduce this anticipated impact? And the purpose of us conducting a co-creation of a driver analysis is mainly to understand how do the different risks interact. And once we've understood that, how do we inform early action, and for whom and where do we take these early actions? So the process that I'm briefly going to describe is still in progress. It's still a raw process. We are still navigating and figuring out our fit in this. So we are happy to learn from our colleagues, Lindsay and who are already ahead in terms of this driver analysis. But I will share with you what is happening from the perspective of Zambia, and particularly the engagement of Zambia Red Cross. So this co-creation process is mainly focusing on 4 questions to be able to understand the risks and then eventually identify where do we want to take action. And I'm also happy to note that in the poll, when they asked us what is the value of the compound of compound risks, and we all said we want to know, most of us said we want to know where do we target and who do we target. So this clearly ties into the purpose for why we are doing this, this process. So this process looks at 4 main questions. And here, of course, like I'd mentioned, we're working with the Zambia Red Cross to be able to conduct this analysis. So we are looking at 4 questions: which disasters or triggering events have been happening in a certain community and at what season? And then when you think of yourself as an external field worker, as a humanitarian, what do you think is causing community suffering? And then we should be able to answer the questions: what are the main sector and assets affected? And at what point in time are they affected? And then based on the experience, how do we connect all these pieces of information to be able to know, where are the linkages, where can we address, where can we put our energies to be able to address these risks? So these are the 4 main guiding questions for this process. And the next slide here, it's quite messy. This is a reflection of feedback from those 4 questions that have been conducted. So what happened was that Zambia Red Cross volunteers and staff went to a community, asked the community these 4 questions, and based on the responses that were conducted, that were received from the community, we were able to kind of, disseminate this information, dissect this information, and be able to try and make sense out of this information. So I don't know if you can clearly see that the blue boxes kind of reflect the hazards that that the community faces. So communities mentioned, they are impacted by floods, they are impacted by drought, they are impacted, of course, by COVID, as we are all aware, they are impacted by locusts. So that is what the communities identified as what affects them. And then, of course, now the second, the first step is, of course, identifying what are the hazards that affect this community, kind of linked to the ACAP's situation analysis in their process that they undertake. So we also undertake a similar process as part of the situation analysis. What are the risks? And that is listed in the blue. That is listed in the blue boxes. Then the second step, which is the yellow, is to identify what are the sectors that are affected by these hazards. Is it, for example, wash sector, and as a result of within the wash, what exactly is the problem? So they did mention that as a result of flood, usually the water is affected, and this affects the water quality. So that is clustered under the wash sector. And then during the drought, and even as a result of floods, there is a crop failure, and that is clustered under agriculture. So that step clusters the impacts per the sector. And then when you jump to the third step, which on my right side is the red boxes. So here, the red boxes is looking at the impacts that the community faces from an external point of from an external person's point of view. The Zambia Red Cross, what have they witnessed as the impacts of these hazards? Of course, they've seen that there are quite a number of within a particular community. They've looked at maybe the health records, and then there's a high incidence of mortality and morbidity, either due to the impacts of the hazards that have been mentioned, or they're looking at poverty as a result of people's livelihoods that have been affected because of these hazards. So the red one is mainly looking at the observed impacts from an external eye. And then when you look at the fourth step, which in this case is at the yellow boxes next to the red, these are looking at the direct causes of suffering within the community. So for example, if people are suffering from cholera, what is causing the cholera? Is it that the people do not have, people have limited knowledge in terms of hygiene and sanitation? Is it that people do not have access to sanitation facilities? Is it that the water quality is not good enough to ensure access to clean water? So you are looking at an analysis based on the effects, the direct effects of these hazards to the community. And then the box 5, which is a tiny green on the top, kind of looks at, okay, now we do have these 4 boxes. We do have the blue, which is the hazards. We do have the yellow, the sectors that are affected. We do have the red, the impacts from an external point of view. And then we do have the orange, the direct impacts onto a community and why are they suffering. So how do we make these pieces of work? How do we link this? What is the missing gap? And of course, just when you look at the arrows, it's quite messy. And indeed, that is a true reflection that this process it's kind of messy. We are still navigating ourselves. We're still understanding and analyzing this information. And so, for example, if we are saying that communities are suffering from, communities are poor, why are they poor? Is it because, because of COVID, their livelihoods has been affected? Is it because that the floods, destroyed their gardens and they were not able to get a harvest for which they were able to sell? So you kind of begin analyzing what are the linkages between these various causes and effects, Where does, for example, where do you have a triple effect coming as a result of one hazard? If people are being forced out of their homes, what is making them move out of their homes? And this whole process, when we are asking ourselves these questions and reflecting on them, is because eventually we want to know, where do we target the early actions that we'd like to take? Okay, and if you see the various arrows, so where you see very many lines headed to, that kind of gives us an idea of where we should prioritize for our early actions. And after all this process is completed, we would like to link it up to the already developed anticipatory system that I had earlier mentioned, so that we are able to, to see a visualization, where are areas of high risk, and what risks would these people be exposed to? So, for example, based on this brief analysis, there was a geographical presentation of saying district XYZ is susceptible to hazards, floods, drought, and COVID. Another district is highly susceptible to only floods and COVID. So this analysis would help let us know that these are the areas of high risk. And for those hazards that can be forecastable, for example, the floods, we already have a system that has been developed to be able to anticipate flooding. How do we integrate that? So this is still work in progress, as I'd said, and hopefully we should be able to share with you in the coming months how this process is evolving. So in terms of the next steps, we are seeing here that we would like to add another geographical dimension to rank the areas of the country by the number of disasters affecting in a certain area. I'd already mentioned that, and then later we will create these graphs for each of the geographical areas, and then extract the vulnerable groups, and eventually be able to present this in a dashboard that we already have. So we do have a dashboard for the anticipatory system, but we would like to be able to integrate a part of this information that we are getting out of this analysis. And again, just to emphasize that this is a complex process for us, it's a learning process for us, and it is relevant if we are able to shift from from reactionary to anticipatory, and we are hoping that this should be able to strengthen and make our anticipatory systems robust for those hazards that we can anticipate. For those that we cannot, of course, knowing that there are different skills and mandates of various stakeholders, as already mentioned by the previous speakers, we would like to tap into that expertise. Can we collaborate together to be able to ensure that this time we are better at coordinating to address the risks and the disasters don't beat us into this coordination? So thank you so much, Bianca. I'm happy to address any questions. Over to you.
Thank you, Irene. So before we open for questions, let's go to Connor for his intervention. Connor, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me? Is that all right? Okay, super. Thanks for having the opportunity to speak today. So, in terms of this session titled "From Analysis to Action," I think I've got a fair amount of experience in generating analyses that don't seem to end up resulting in any discernible action. So I can perhaps offer a few perspectives there, and then also touch briefly as well on compound risk in relation to risk financing as well. So to begin with, I thought maybe I can offer some perspectives on what makes a good risk analysis, to discuss a little bit around the challenges of translating analysis into action, and some potential workarounds perhaps, and then finally to touch, like I say, on compound risk as it relates to risk financing. So firstly, what makes a good risk analysis? And so when considering this question, I think it can be useful to think as risk job it is to create actionable information. So what this means is ideally that analyses are designed with a prior understanding of what the actual actions they're intended to inform are. So analyses and action then have to both be considered together, and then that actionable information is the bridge between the analysis and the action. I think one of the practical points here is that ultimately different types of analyses are going to be appropriate in different types of situations. Unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all compound risk analysis that's going to be equally appropriate in all situations. What the compound risk monitor in particular allows us to do is, I think it was discussed earlier, is that it provides a platform for further investigation. So it really starts to uncover where there are those different drivers of compound risk, and that information then can lead to further investigation and maybe more targeted analyses that are more context and use case specific. I think in this sense, it can also be useful to think about risk analysis as a bit of a reverse engineering exercise. And I think Irene's description there of that community-led compound risk analysis really highlights this point really. So the first step really is to identify and define the risk in terms of what it is, who or what it affects, and how it affects them. To identify who is responsible for managing that risk. And then to determine what options are available to manage it and what actions need to be taken. And at this point, then it's possible to identify what that particular piece of actionable information is. So what information and what level of information is needed to make decisions. And then finally, to start thinking about how to construct the risk analysis itself. In reality, it's never as straightforward as this. But I think when building out risk analyses specifically and particularly for complex risk types, it can be very useful to have a clear understanding of what the potential use case is. Equally as important as defining the use case is clearly identifying who the user or the users of the information are. And the analyses then need to be tailored to suit their needs. This influences how analyses are designed and importantly communicated. So the best analysis in the world won't really result in any action if the key people don't understand or trust the results. So real engagement across the risk analysts and the key stakeholders, including key decision makers, is really where enabling analysis leading to action actually happens. So ideally, those key stakeholders are engaged in the design of the analysis itself, and that's not always an easy process. When those key decision makers or stakeholders are involved in the design of the analysis, it's more likely to be incorporated into those decision-making processes. So rather than a decision maker having analysis foisted upon them and have to sort of quickly work to understand what it is and how they can use it, actually involving those decision makers in the design of those analyses themselves. So that whole process can help to generate a level of ownership and understanding and trust in the results, which is really fundamental to ensuring that analysis is taken forward into action and taken forward in a sort of continued and iterative way, such that the analysis is refined through time, and it becomes a bit of a feedback loop then, whereby the analysis can inform better actions, and the actions can then better inform what the right analysis is. So it's a whole iterative process. In my experience, I think the process of carrying out a risk analysis itself can be more informative than the results themselves. So it's another reason why to involve various stakeholders in the analysis, really expose them to the assumptions and the work in can be as valuable as any individual risk analysis results. So that engagement across different decision makers and stakeholders is really quite critical to ensuring that action follows analysis. Then maybe briefly to touch on what this idea of compounding means in terms of financial risk management. So I think it's fairly clear that compounding risk can be relatively complex concept. I think at this stage, there's been a huge amount of work done towards trying to, define the edges of the problem, and really what the compound risk monitor does is allows you to identify where those particular drivers are risk with in different situations. So given the sort of actual compound impacts and the way that risks interact is still highly uncertain, that doesn't mean that we can't still plan for those uncertainties. So I think just first and foremost, recognizing that there is a high potential for compounding in certain situations, even when it's not possible to accurately define or quantify that risk. Just recognizing that it exists and treating it as an uncertainty allows you then to make better plans. So for example, I think there's a range of pragmatic approaches to managing highly complex or uncertain risks. For example, in the context of designing risk financing strategies for situations where you can identify that there's a material risk of compounding, but you can't quite define what the size of it is. A simple approach might be simply to build in additional financial buffers into your financial strategy to account for those unpredictable or unforeseeable risks. Another point is that I suppose although compound interactions themselves might be quite complex and difficult to define and measure, if, for example, we identify what those drivers are, so for example, if cyclone risk in a particular region is identified as being a potential large cause of compound risk, then you can monitor cyclone risk and build additional financial buffers into how you treat that. So treat it as an uncertainty loading factor in for example, how you design triggers or payouts. I think certainly we're very much at the start of the learning curve with compound risk. And while there's a large amount of uncertainty, it can help, I think, to take a rather conservative approach to it. So rather than trying to be too technical or try to create fancy analyses and things like that, there really is a fitness for purpose argument here, where like has been mentioned earlier today, it's going to be a mix of qualitative and quantitative analyses that inform decision making. So I think in summary, it's just it's going to be it's great that this conversation on compound risk and multi-risk analysis is taking place. I think it's going to really lay the foundation for being able to better measure and manage compound risk, not only during COVID, but also beyond this crisis and for other situations. So it's really promising to be part of this conversation. I think I'll finish there.
Thank you, Connor. But very good points on the sort of the challenges of dealing with all this complexity when making operational and financing decisions, and the need for simplicity and taking that complexity into account. So before I hand over to Nicola, who is going to share some reflections and sort of help us, I think, bring some threads together from the various presentations that we heard today, and help us wrap up a little bit. We have another poll for you, just 2 more questions. So Thibaut, if you don't mind sharing the QR code and the link with the audience. Susie and Thibault? Yes, coming up. Okay, great. So please do click on the link, use the QR code, final 2 questions. So we want to hear from you about what types of decisions you think should be informed by compound risk monitoring and analytics, based on what you heard today about the challenges, the complexity, the uncertainties. What do you think we can realistically, what type of decisions we can realistically inform, and what do you wish we could inform with compound risk monitoring and analytics? So it's quite even. Now, country level preparedness planning and response strategies are definitely top of mind for most of you, and then national and subnational early warning systems and global humanitarian financing allocations are also up there. Very interesting. Then second question, in your experience, what is the biggest barrier in turning analysis into action? This is very much relevant here, and a question that we try to address, and that we have to keep top of mind as we develop these risk monitoring systems. Many of you think that limited incentives for action are one of the biggest, are probably the biggest barrier, and engaging key stakeholders is also very important and top of mind for many of you. Seems to be taking over. Okay, thanks so much for that. And now let me hand over to Nicola, who is going to share some reflections from her side and help us wrap up a little bit this discussion. And then we will hopefully have a few minutes left for any questions that are left. Over to you, Nicola.
Thank you very much, Bianca, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at this really great event. It's great to see us talking about this important issue and so many brilliant talks. So to explain who I am, my name is Nicola Ranger. I work partly for the University of Oxford and partly for the World Bank as a senior consultant in the disaster risk finance and insurance program. I just want to offer a few reflections to give us time for discussion at the end. Reflections both on what we've heard, particularly from the last 2 speakers, but also then what does this actually mean? So how do you actually operationalize this in practice? One of the first reflections that I want to make is on the good point that Connor made about this sort of perceived complexity and how, is this too complicated? Can we actually use this information? Can we actually do anything? And so I've been working on this topic of compound risk with Bianca and Lindsay in particular from around March. So when COVID kicked in to the major extent, the first thing we started thinking about was, okay, what if something else can happen? What if a disaster happens as well? We need to work out, as the World Bank is thinking about responding to this particular crisis and in that emergency, thinking about, okay, but what could happen down the line? What are the risks down the line that actually we should be preparing for now and supporting countries to prepare? And actually one of the pieces of feedback that we got at the time was, this crisis is already bad enough. Why are you thinking about what could happen? But one of the things I want to emphasize is that, one, these issues that we're talking about of compound risk are not new. So, I've been working in this area for many years, and when we're working in country, and we saw there this priority on country preparedness. When you're working in country, these compound risks are happening all the time. So for example, working in East Africa on drought response, a big factor that is impacting drought response is oil prices, strangely enough. So that really affects the ability of the government to respond, and affects the ability of markets to respond. So these compounding risks are happening, but I think what's happened with COVID is it's really obviously shown this to its fullest extent. And one of the things that I've been advocating for, and this is a personal reflection, is to, when we're thinking about building back better post-COVID, in the recovery phase, is we need to take this more integrated view of risk. So there's a big focus right now on building back better in terms of health systems, in terms of building climate resilience. But I think that we're missing the need to learn from COVID and other disasters about making a much more integrated approach. So I would very strongly advocate for that. The other point I want to make is, and maybe I can go forward 2 slides. And what does this actually mean at a national level? So next slide, please. So in our work on compound risk in the team, we've been very much looking at what does this actually mean for, say, a Ministry of Finance thinking about how to manage these risks? And trying to shift towards, from just focusing on weather or natural disasters, to thinking in a much broader way. And one of the things that we see is that countries at the moment do not plan in this integrated way, particularly at that kind of Ministry of Finance level. So, even in OECD countries, there's only 2 countries that actually considered pandemics within their financial risk management framework, for example. So we've been strongly advocating for thinking about risk in this integrated way, and thinking about how risk can compound to be prepared for when this happens, because this isn't just COVID, this happens, and particularly in a climate change context, when we're thinking about building resilience going forwards, these sort of complex risks we will see much more of. The other point that I want to make is around sort of shock responsive systems. So a lot of the work that was done, particularly in the early stages of the COVID response, was transforming the systems that were in place for responding to climate emergencies, drought, earthquakes, or natural disasters, into response mechanisms that could work for COVID response. So, for example, making social protection systems able to flex to respond to the pandemic. And one of the other things I would like to advocate for as we move into thinking about how to operationalize this is, rather than going back to just thinking about systems that flex for climate, or health systems that flex for health shocks, thinking about how we can maintain these shock responsive systems that we've built during COVID to help us in the future to deal with these sorts of compounding risks in the future, to not lose that preparedness and resilience that we've built over the last few months, and think about that as we're building into the COVID recovery phase, to maintain that. Another point that I would make is around anticipatory financing and what this means. And I guess this comes back to a comment that Irene made. And I really liked Irene's presentation, because it was really about, on the ground, engaging communities in this, which I think is absolutely critical. But one point that was sort of implied that I disagree with was this notion of, let's think about what risks we can forecast and what risks we can't forecast. And it implies that we can only do ex ante action for risks we can forecast, or early action for risks we can forecast. And I think that yes, in some cases it is difficult to forecast these risks, particularly if we look at conflict, these sort of macro fiscal, how that is all interacting, this complexity. But I do think that through better monitoring, we can act earlier. So putting in place these systems for monitoring, as you've seen that have been presented today, allow us to try to anticipate these. It's not formal forecasting, but it's anticipating through early monitoring and act early. So I really feel that it's not a case of forecast or not forecast, but thinking about monitoring risk, getting an early sight of what could happen, where risk could compound. It's not complex. So what you've seen here, for example, from Lindsay, is just looking at where different risks are overlaying, but that can be incredibly informative for decision makers. And I'll leave it there. Thank you for the great talks today.
Thank you so much, Nicola. And thank you for sharing those reflections and for helping us kind of wrap up. So we have 4 minutes left, and we're going to try to be on time. So let's see if there are any questions. I saw there was a question for Irene in the chat about whether whether the questions that you highlighted in your presentation were asked or will be asked to the people affected, and who is the target audience for the dashboard that you mentioned in your presentation. And I don't see other questions in the chat right now, but if people in the audience would like to ask any questions, please do add it to the chat or raise your hand in the chat to be able to ask a question. But Irene, I don't know if you wanted to respond to the question that was posed to you.
Sure, thanks a lot. The target audience for the dashboard is the government, but at this point in time, it's still being held by the Red Cross as they're still sorting out the management issues. But the long-term vision is that the government should be the DRM agency for the government should be the holder of this dashboard, and this should be linked up to the National Early Warning System. And then in regards to the target, the communities who are to be interviewed, because of COVID, focus group discussions were not held, but key informant interviews were held with community members to be able to provide answers to those questions. Thank you, Bianca.
Thank you, Irene. So I don't see other questions coming up. So I think we can wrap up for today. With only 2 minutes to go. So we have one question coming in. From Karina. Karina was asking, in terms of directing funding, where should we be focusing future financing to be most efficient on compound risks? So it's a difficult question, a very good one. I don't know who wants to take it. Perhaps Connor, Nicola, Dirk-Jan, any thoughts on this?
Maybe just it's a good question. I think this is where, risk analysis and some things like the compound risk monitor and actually trying to identify where those drivers are come really into play. I don't think there's a simple answer to that question. Yeah.
Maybe just to add on, so obviously there are different types of financing. There's financing for building resilience, and I think there's sorts of tools that have been shown today to help us understand the hotspots of risk and help there. But then there's also the question of the sort of prearranged financing, the risk financing. And one of the things that we've found through our work is the need for different types of financing for different types of risk. So it's not one risk financing instrument for compound risk, but thinking about how you can combine different instruments to create robust, predictable financing. And we have some examples of that, particularly from fragile states of where we've implemented that. I'd be happy to provide more information on.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think it's as you highlighted, Nicola, I think it's and Connor, I think there's both financing to help us make better decisions. So to help us better understand and monitor compound risk, but then also to be better prepared, be able to respond. So I think both are needed. Okay, so let's wrap things up. Thanks everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks to our speakers. It was very, very, very interesting. Thank you to the team behind all of this that made this happen. Thibaut, Susie, Arno, Lindsay. Thank you. Thank you to the partners, World Bank, UN-OCHA, UN PBSO, who are partnering with us on this. So and again, thank you also for engaging. As I think Joao mentioned, we're really trying to develop and facilitate a community of practice on this topic to help us push this agenda forward, both in terms of our understanding of how risks interact, in terms of our methods and approaches to monitor those risks, and then approaches to using that analysis to inform decisions about financing and operational decisions. So you'll hear more from us, and we really hope that that all of you participated today will be part of this growing community of practice going forward. Thank you again. Have a nice day, everyone.